All right. Today we're gonna lecture about the humans in Latin America, and in particular, we're gonna emphasize different pre-Columbian cultures. Interestingly enough, in Latin America, we do see a recent history of humans. We don't really have any real species of hominids other than Homo sapiens. So we see that the most accepted ages or times for the first records of humans are about 13,000 years ago. More recently, we see evidence for being older, about 20,000 years ago. We see, and we're going to talk about it, it's a record coming from footprints in New Mexico. So that's something quite exciting. And as we can imagine, these things are in continuous change. So science is coming with new evidence of human presence in the Americas earlier than we thought. But in fact, there is something to emphasize, that in the rich record, well, current richer is a little overextended, of human forms or hominid forms, we see here that the only one that came into the Americas is Homo sapiens. We don't have any evidence of any other forms like a Homo erectus who happen to be extended all over the Middle East and even in Asia. Those things are not really even close to the Americas. So the record in America happens to be quite recent, and it's a really interesting history of isolation. So the human lines we see here, this is us, Homo sapiens sapiens, and we see a variety of Homo present in Europe and Middle East, Homo neanderthalensis, which happen to be kind of not really a very well-defined species, but is still there anyway. But the only one that happens to be in America is Homo sapiens. And this species, as we know, originated in Africa, like all the human species, about 200,000 years ago. So none of these forms is present in the America, except Homo sapiens. And the only record we have in the early Americans are classically the Clovis culture, about 13,500 years ago. It was the de facto oldest record. Later, we got a fact in Chile, quite far south in Chile, well dated with 14,700 years. And now we are getting records from Cactus Hill in Virginia. That is about 18,000 years ago. But Buttermilk Creek in Texas is about 15,000 years ago. So we are getting better and better records and evidence of older incidents of Homo sapiens in the America. Allegedly, the way they dispersed from the Asian continent was crossing through the low land of Beringia. Beringia happens when the sea level dropped about 120 meters 18,000 years ago. So land was emerged, so it was possible to cross over from the Asia, North Asia into the Americas and vice versa. In fact, it's a well-established fact of migration between mammals using the same route. So Homo sapiens, as we see here, originated in Africa, migrate all over the place, reaching Australia, remarkably, about 40,000 years ago. Notice we're talking about years before the present. And we see here, 14,000 years ago is in the northern part of the Siberian area and close to the Kamchatka Peninsula, and the Beringia happens to be around this area where it goes into Alaska. So that's possibly it happens in that way. In fact, it's two different ways to explain this in a better light. One is crossing to Beringia into the land, waiting until the continental ice weaken away to allow for the passage into the central part of North America and then all the way to South America. And the other idea is using the coastal road. Coastal road theory is probably one way that happens. The only reason that we don't really know much about it is because now the sea level that was lower by 120 meters now is higher into the actual level, which is obviously 120 meters over the previous land. So now all that corridor is underwater. In fact, there are some efforts about doing underwater archaeology, but obviously it's much more difficult to do. So we have some dates in here. Monteverde in Chile, 14,700 years ago. And then we see Cactus Hills, 18,000 years ago. Clovis in general, 13,000 years ago. And now Buttermilk Creek, which is not far from here in Dallas, we're going to see that, is older than that. So these two theories happen to be more or less accepted by everyone with some restrictions. This is a very nice graphic coming from the National Geographic magazine. We see here the Monteverde age, 14,000 years ago, and we see here Cactus Hill, and some other, probably 15,000 is quite close in here. So more and more sites and places are being discovered with more clarification about humans arriving earlier than we thought. Clovis technology is de facto date when we see good evidence of this particular tool in here. Particular tool is a very good projectile used for big game. It wasn't really mounted in a long shaft, but kind of a short one, like this one in here, and use it with something called an attrat. That attrat is actually holding the lower part of the short lance like that, and using the momentum of that to produce a much more energetic throwing of this particular short lance. So Clovis people were essentially specializing in hunting big game. It's characterized by this depression in the arrow point where it was mounted on the short lance. The spears were very effective tools. And we see here is a map about it. In general, we see Clovis, particular well-defined Clovis, and see Folsom here, a variant of the Clovis in different areas, more or less in the central United States. So this is the way they were hunting. Obviously, not just one. We got to be very lucky to kill one of these huge mammoths with just one shot, but probably there were several working together to bring down this large game. Monteverde, famous because it was the oldest human occupation site, is very far south, right here in Chile. Most of the tools recovered from the places are organic in nature, meaning, well, they were confectioned using bone, using reeds and pieces of wood, working with fire in order to make it a little harder, and it's well preserved because it's coming from a place where the anoxic environment of this bog preserved the tools for a long time. So Monteverde is famous, but it's been displayed for some other places. We see now right here in Texas, not far from Dallas, about 50 miles south, we see a place called the Buttermilk Creek, and this complex is rewarding us with very interesting assemblages dated about 15,000 years ago. So we do have evidence in Texas. It's a paper in here. If you're going to follow it, the DOE is available, and the link is working. This is the place. You take 35 south, close to Salado, and then I should say this is a private land, so nobody goes in there or shouldn't go. But it's not really far from it. And so this 2 miles. So in about 4 or 5 miles from 35, you can actually go and see the place. Not that it's open, but it's nice to know that it's so close. This is coming from Science, and the article where Walters published their findings, and this is an idea where it was still being worked. Some of the profiles are representing different levels of occupation. As we know, the oldest one is the one in the bottom. This is true for all geological endeavors. And we see here different datations, 8,000 all the way to 15,000 years of age. Normally, radiocarbon dates are produced from charcoal, from the old fires in the place. Some of the artifacts recovered from Buttermilk Creek, not very spectacular, not even close to what we see from Clovis, but still, without question, produced by human action. Now, not too far ago, in fact, the last year, we find out there's a new evidence of humans in New Mexico. And they happened during the last glacial maximum. You know, the glacial maximum happens about 20,000, 18,000 to 20,000 years ago. So this one is coming from New Mexico in a place famous because the sands are actually gypsum. So that gypsum is producing dunes, which are very peculiar characteristic of being made out of pieces of gypsum. And the marks in the flat, in the lake, are without question human. So it's a study about it, where the human footprints are being studied and dated, and the dates are telling us consistently over 20,000 years ago. So this is so far the oldest evidence of humans in Latin America, or in America if you want to. It's a profile of the section 2 with different environments, and it's representing in here in all these levels how many footprints are in each one of the levels. This one is with 5, 2, how many people were doing it. This is 1. If they have also big mammals in the same level. So these things is this study is a really good one. The ages, 22,000 to 21,000. So consistently is below 20,000 years. If you want to read the paper in Science, the link is right here. And if you're going to see the video, and we're going to embed it into this video, it's a very interesting video of the news in PBS. It's about 5 minutes, so we're going to watch.
Seed layer age, it's about 23,000 years old. And at the top, where the people were still walking around and where we have our highest seed layer, it's about 21,000 years old. So we basically documented 2,000 years of human occupation in this area at White Sands a long, long time ago.
Archaeologists have long believed that humans arrived in North America 13,500 to 16,000 years ago, after a period of warming had melted massive glaciers, opening up a land passage from Asia to North America.
This is just so much older. And then our first reaction is, oh my God, we better check everything because these better be right.
Jeff Pagatti says he has a 95% confidence level in the accuracy of the dating.
We're as sure as you can possibly be scientifically that's actually the case.
But the evidence isn't rock solid, say some archaeologists.
The critical issues here are, is the dating reliable?
David Meltzer is an archaeologist at Southern Methodist University in Texas. He believes dating seeds from an aquatic plant to tell the age of the footprints is potentially problematic and says it's just too early to be confident.
The people that are doing this, that are doing the work, they're pros. They know what they're doing. They know what they're about. But here's the thing. Nature has a mischievous streak, and nature has fooled us before. So the motto here is trust but verify.
Jeff Pagatti and Kathleen Springer with the U.S. Geological Survey expected scrutiny and are now working to radiocarbon date pollen found in the rock layers. And even then, there's so much yet to uncover.
So we want to expand the story to not just occupation for 2,000 years between 23 and 21, but what if it looks more like this? People were here for much longer.
If the findings hold up, it could spark a re-examination of similar dry lakebed sites in the Southwest, and that could reveal even older evidence of humanity's foothold in North America. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Stephanie Sy.
So I hope you enjoy it. That video is a short overview of what happened. There are other videos. In fact, it's a whole Nova special about the New Mexico's White Sands footprints. It's coming to be a very famous place right now. If we go farther south, I mean all the way to the south part of Latin America, in Cueva de las Manos, in a quick translation, this is the cave of the hands, or the handprints, if you want. In the south part of Argentina, there are paintings here. These paintings are representing, obviously, something we see here in this picture, the guanacos. Guanacos are wild relatives of llamas and vicuñas. In fact, they are members of the family of the camels, which is originated in North America and then moved all the way south, where we find them quite abundantly even today. And the footprints are here. One, there's another one here, several other symbols. So it's an interesting cultural artifact. The age, 10,000 years, not as old as we've been talking. Now, something is coming into our attention here. We did human coexist with large mammals in the Americas, North and South and Central America. We do have holy mammoths, Columbian mammoths, mastodons, 3 different kinds of giant sloths, giant armadillos, like this one in here, horses, several species of horses, giant bisons, and so all these big mammals disappear about 10,000 years ago. What's the reason? Well, most probably it's a combination of 2 things. So we see there are 2 different ways to try to explain this. One is about global climate, or climate change, and the other one is hunting to extinction by humans. So which one is the one? Well, obviously, we think it's a conjunction of the 2 things. Global change, global climate change was happening, the glacial age was ending, temperature and precipitation was different, and humans were extending. And we're very, very fond of hunting up all these big mammals. Some of them which are very, very easy to hunt. And you see a giant armadillo, maybe well protected about a saber-tooth tiger trying to get them, but humans are very persistent and probably didn't have any chance. So there's a really interesting study here, if you want to go and read it, about what happened in the Americas, which is right here. And we see in a big number here, what happened with extinct forms. We see 50 large game were extincted, went into extinction in the interval between 15 to 10,000 years ago. During the same period in North America, 33. But if we go into places like Africa, only 8. In the central part of Western Europe, 9. So why so many? Australia is another one where a big change happens, but it happens much earlier. So it seems to be that the influence of humans in this particular study is quite large. Animals were not afraid of humans because they didn't have any experience, and they essentially were hunted. In any case, the paper is available in Science, 2004. It's an interesting one. So there's no climatic change happens right here. This is the symbol, climatic change here, and here, and here, in Europe, in here, but seems to be a little more towards the human influence. Anyway, now, about cultures, what kind of cultures we see in Latin America. So we divide this in 3 different places: South America, Middle America, and North America here. And we go through the different phases: arrival, the establishment of agriculture, and then different cultures. So what we see here, in the beginning, everyone in Middle, South, and North America were essentially hunters. Hunter and gatherers, obviously. You see here that happened in Peru and Argentina. It happens in Middle America too, and obviously happened in North America too. As soon as 4,000 years ago, and here we have to make a point. The years in this particular graphics are AD, so we go from 0 here all the way to 2022, and we go from 0 all the way to 10,000 here. So, you know, BC, AD, we tend to no longer use it, but in this particular graphic is still available. So we see in about 3,500 years BC, we see cultivation happens in South America, Central America, and so on. And as we go from the agriculture to culture, we start to see some evidence of ceremonial centers in South America, the Olmecs in Mesoamerica or Central America, if you want. And then as we go into the 500 BC, we start to see different cultures in South America. Not the Incas yet, careful about that. Chavin, Paracas, then Mochicas, Nazca, and Tiwanaco, in different areas of South America. In the north, towards the south, in the high lands, and in the coastal area, particularly Paracas is from the coastal area. The Middle America, we see Teotihuacan is one of the most important cultures in central Mexico, and the Mayans in the Caribbean Atlantic side. And as we arrive to 1,000, 1,500 AD, we see the Inca Empire. The Inca Empire really took over all the other cultures in a big, large amalgamation of all these different cultures. The Incas were interesting because in a way they were conquering the different cultures and absorbed them in a way. So common language, trying to establish a common language, they established a communication system. They established also a way to contribute to the big empire, very much like the Romans were doing. So big, large empire all over South America and quite close to Central America, at least in the beginning. In central Mexico, the Aztecs are taking over most of the central area, and the Mayas in Yucatan enjoy a brief period into the last part of the 1500th century. So we're going to go over a few of these different places, different cultures. One thing we're going to emphasize, the economy in pre-Columbian cultures was essentially based in agriculture, nothing else. Particular maize, what we call corn. Tools, metallic tools were very difficult to use. They are most used stone tools for everything. They start using copper, they start using bronze later. Gold and silver, obviously, it was only for ornamental purposes. They didn't develop the wheel at all. Probably the reason is because they were living in high relief places. They got no draft animals. So that's probably one of the reasons. What's the point of having a wheel if you don't have anything to pull it over? They do domesticate the dog and the turkey to some extent in Mesoamerica, which is including Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and Costa Rica, all those areas. The Incas, on the other way, they do have a draft animal of a sort, the llama. They were able to do very fine pottery, which is remaining until today. They were producing beautiful weaves made out of cotton and wool, and in particular some cultures were incredibly in the way they produce those textiles. So we see this very old graphic in here from Stewart, 1969. We see the Middle America, we see the Aztecs and Toltecs and Mayas, which are actually older, including the Olmecs are even the oldest. This is sometimes called the mother culture of Mesoamerica. And we see in South America, essentially all those Mochicas, Chavin, which is a very old one, and Tiwanaku were absorbed by the Incas later. Now, in the Old War, by that time, trying to establish a correlation in chronology, we see conquistadors coming and taking over the Incas and taking over the Aztecs in the majority. So one of the big advantages of the conquistadors were the weapons. They were well armed with steel and even gunpowder, which not really was very important, but they came with an advantage, obviously. Now, something that is very important is agriculture. Obviously, we just mentioned it was all these cultures were based in agriculture. So we see here the time, almost the accepted time where domestication of different species were start to be used as a crop. And we see here, these are years BC, all right? So this is today all the way to 8,000 BC. I'm sorry, no. Anyway, no, these are not year BC.
What's confusing?
No, see, year BC, this is 0, meaning what?
Year 0 BC. That's when it switched over to 0 AD. Right? AD.
I guess. Yeah.
Birth of Christ.
Yeah.
You want to redo that?
All right, in this slide we see the pre-Columbian agriculture of different crops as they were domesticated by different places. We see here Mesoamerica and the Andes, and the highlands and the coast in the Andes, and in general Mesoamerica as a whole. So we see here the first crop that was domesticated, or at least one of the first ones, was the maize, corn, like we call it. Previously, we have the chili pepper, avocado, maguey, and bodegor. You know, gourds are used for storage, so probably was a necessity even before for gatherers. And then they start using textiles, cotton, to make textiles, and peanut. And in the Andes, we start to see one of the first to be adapted was the bean, quinoa, and then we see maize over here. The time of the maize being domesticated into the Mesoamerica and the Andes is different, and most probably was introduced by trade from the Mesoamericans into the Andes in a way. So, you see, in the coast, we see here maize adopted quite later. So these things are still being worked out, but it's very interesting. In fact, we know by all these different evidence from archaeological sites that the different kinds of maize is produced in the Valley of Mexico. So here the original one, Teosinte, is one of the first original corn. And then we see all the different hybrids and adaptation resulting in the later one here. This is an actual modern hybrid that was produced recently. So the maize is coming from Mexico, and eventually it was cultivated together with the three different crops being called the three sisters. We see maize, beans, and pumpkins. All those things together make a perfect combination, being corn, a good provider of carbohydrates, beans, a good provider of protein, and we do have also pumpkins in a way. So we see here an actual imagine from the Aztecs with Tlaloc is one of the gods with a plant of maize, a container with beans, and making a point about how important it was for this culture. The pre-Columbian civilizations more or less can be mapped in this way. So we see here originally the Olmecs, 1200 BC to 800 BC in this area here, Olmecs, Mexico. Classic Maya Empire, 200 to 900 AD, this area. The Toltecs were in the central part of Mexico, in this area here, between 800 to 1200 AD, later replaced by the Aztecs right away, between 1200 to 1520 AD. So, you know, when we talk about the Aztecs as being the oldest, and we talk about the Inca being the oldest, it's not really absolutely true, because they are fairly recent in the history. So, you know, only 300 years, more or less, each one of these empires before the conquistadors came over. In fact, the Inca Empire took a big chunk of the Andean America from other previous cultures. The oldest one, the Olmec, is 1200 BC to 800 BC. Very interesting culture. In fact, one of the most interesting features is these giant basaltic heads, which are all over the place. They originated other cultures, so that's the reason they call it the mother culture of the Middle American civilizations. In general, we're in the coastal area, close to Veracruz in Mexico. Very many sculptures, large ones made out of basalt, small ones made out of jade, which is quite interesting. And they did have a writing, which is not really very common in the pre-Columbian cultures. They trade with the Valley of Mexico, not with the Aztecs, obviously, because they happen to be in a different time. But in general, the pre-Columbian cultures in Mesoamerica are the Olmecs here in this area, in the proximity of Veracruz, the Tehuatihuacan state in the highlands in what is now the Mexica Center. The Toltec Empire went all the way to the north and into the south, more or less in this area here. The Aztec Empire later, obviously, it happened to be a little less. The Aztec was over here and here. And then the Inca Empire is more or less restricted to this point in here, in the Yucatan Peninsula, and a little further south. Izapa here, or Izapan style, is a variant of the Mayans in a way, an older kind of Mayan culture. So starting from the south, the Mayan civilization in what is called the classic period goes from 200 to 900 AD, and so it's a period of about 700 years, including the Mayan territory was essentially the whole peninsula Yucatan, including Guatemala, Mexico, Honduras, and El Salvador. They were obviously based in agriculture, maize being the primary crop. They do have a remarkable architecture, as we see here, big, large pyramids in Uxmal, in Mayapan, Copan, Chichen Itza, and all these places are spectacular areas where it can even be visited today. They did have some kind of writing, but it was a highly difficult hieroglyphic notation. These are recorded mythological history, hard to establish if it's really true or just a way of telling mythical histories. So, Mayans. Toltecs, these are actually from 800 to 1200 AD, and they are replaced right away by the Aztecs. They were in the same area where the Aztecs are coming later, in the Central Valley of Mexico. They were quite related to the Maya civilization. In fact, big part of what we see as Toltec ruins are in Chichen Itza, in Yucatan, that today we assume as one of the major Mayan places. In fact, part of it is Toltec. They did speak in Nahuatl, which the Aztecs do later. According to what we think happens, in the 12th century, nomads were essentially displacing the Toltecs, and they really disappear without too much evidence of why. But the Aztecs took over. Probably the Aztecs were part of this Toltec losing the bigger empire, and they took over from 1168 AD to 1524 after the Spaniards arrived. They were warriors. Sometimes they hired themselves as mercenaries in local wars between the Toltecs and other tribes. They were essentially all powerful in the Central Valley of Mexico. They ruled about 5 million inhabitants in that time. Tenochtitlan, what we see here in this illustration, was about 300,000 inhabitants in the heyday. This is a very large number. 30,000 inhabitants is one of the largest numbers in that particular time, anywhere in the world. They were warriors, but the way they make war was essentially ceremonial. And not that they were not really killing people, but they were trying to capture, more than anything, the enemy, and then later they use it for sacrifices. This is a typical sword that they were using in the war, produced by wood and with insertion of very sharp pieces of obsidian. Obsidian is a volcanic glass and can be actually very, very sharp. The Aztecs were famous by practicing human sacrifice in large numbers and frequently. Some ideas are they were using this sacrifice in order to produce protein for themselves. So because they consume the sacrifice victims. Interesting enough is one of the reasons what the Spaniards were so furious about the Aztecs doing the normal sacrifice that for them were normal, but the Spaniards were really put off by the whole thing. Well, the time now is going to the south. In particular, the most evidence we have about pre-Columbian cultures is in the Andean region, because the remains, the archaeological remains are much more obvious in those places. So we see here in this particular chronological chart from 1000 BC all the way to the time of the conquest, 1600, the Common Era. So we go from here different initial cultures. We see the Chavin, one of the first, and then Paracas. What is Nazcas, and then we're going to see some of the Chimos, and then the Incas took over about this time in here. The Incas start here, and then they expanded all the way into the Andean South America. So, so here, you see, the Inca did include this territory, part of Argentina and Chile, all the way into Ecuador and even part of Colombia in the last part of the domain. But see, some of those cultures were local, like we see here the Mochica state here. The Nazca culture is in the south here. And all those cultures were absorbed by the Incas. So, different places in here. The earliest one that we're going to talk about was the Chavin culture, 1000 BC to 200 BC. Chavin, beautiful ceramics, as we see here. Some of these carvings. In fact, Chavin culture was called the mother culture of the Andes. Characterized by flat bottom vessels, like the one here. They did have a high regard by making gold ornaments. So obviously the Spaniards were after them. Paracas, a whole different culture, is characterized by textiles. And the reason they got beautiful textiles is also together with the fact that the preservation of these textiles is incredibly good. The Paracas culture, this is one, a whole textile with all these intricate designs. These were used to wrap around mummies, and they were entering this sandy peninsula here. Very dry place, extremely dry place. So in that respect, the preservation of textiles is such, we can even see the colors today. 600 to 100 BC. Another one is Nazca. Nazca goes from 100 BC to 600 AD. Beautiful pottery with really incredibly use of colors in the pottery. Characterized Nazca by a very interesting fact that we read and see videos about the Nazca lines. Nazca lines are very large structures marking the ground by the simple fact of moving stones from one place to the other and producing very large structures or drawings, if you want, in the desertic plains. So for a scale here, we have a few of the designs, and this is about 500 feet from here to here. So these things were in the order of 200 feet. Allegedly very difficult to do if you don't have a way to see it from above, or very good knowledge of topography, because you don't really see your drawing at all. So that's why all these ideas that people are putting out about the Nazca being in relation with some kind of other culture that was able to fly and see things from above. But the fact is, these things are there, and when you see them close by, they don't really look like much. It's only one place without any stone, so you know they were actually cleaning the place out of big stones and leaving it clean, and that's essentially what it is. People don't see it from the ground, so that's why, you know, normally they put roads through it, like here, another one here. So these things sometimes have been desecrated without knowing, but it's a spectacular feature. Right here, we can really see hummingbird in place. Obviously, they know about hummingbirds by going to the forest. This is not a forest, as you can tell. So they knew other places. The culture got communication with other places. They know about monkeys, obviously, and so on. Allegedly, they even know about astronauts. So, you know, this petroglyph in here, sometimes is being named as an astronaut because a big head, probably making allusion to some particular kind of helmet. But anyway, the Nazca lines are in danger. As you see here, this is the Pan American Highway, big 18-wheeler going down right there in the middle of the lines. And some guys are having fun just driving through without any problem. So the age of this is 700 AD, more or less. So now another culture is the Mochi or Mochi, AD 1 to 700. Beautiful pottery. Sometimes you can observe historical details in here and try to establish what happened with them, how it was, their particular lifestyle. Tiwanaku is a very interesting empire. It seems to be they were related to the Incas in a big way. 400 AD to 1000 AD. It's in the southern shore of Lake Titicaca, so Bolivia today. Beautiful bases like this. Chimu is in the north coast of Peru, coastal area. Their cities were constructed not by stone but using adobe. So adobe in a coastal area so dry remains somewhat in there. But you know, periodical rains happen to destroy most of the construction doing adobe. They do have an interesting manufacturing of gold and copper artifacts. They are distinctive by this dark black pottery, characteristic of the Chimu. And finally, the Inca as a whole. The Inca is 1400 to 1500 AD as a whole empire. It was a very large, 4,000 kilometers long. They conquered all the other cultures in a kind of absorption style. They were not really destroying the whole other groups. They absorbed them in a way, so that's the way to make it even larger. So they were all the way from Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, even in the southern part of and the northern part of Argentina and Chile. Um, the Inca Empire was helped by communications. They established a very good way to communicate from places to places by using the chasquis. The chasquis were couriers that were walking, in fact, they were running from place to place and changing with another runner, in a quick way to cover distances in a very, very fast way. In fact, they say the Inca, which is the name of the empire, but it's also the name of the main emperor in that time. We can call it an emperor. Is the Inca. The Inca was able to eat fish fresh from the coast within the day. So the chasquis were taking fish from the coastal area all the way to Cusco, where the Inca got fish for dinner. So they do have this land communication road. In fact, there were no road, it was only for foot traffic, either human or llamas, and they did effectively in that way. The Inca language and culture is still present today in a way by the language. Most of the people in Bolivia, Peru, North Argentina and Chile, Ecuador in part, they speak Quechua. Not just Quechua, but some other languages, but Quechua is the predominant one. They got an interesting writing that is very hard to decipher. It was based in a set of strings with knots. And that was essentially the courier was taken from place to place to exchange information. So still there are many questions about the Incas and many more questions about the previous cultures. Even so, we know a good deal about it. Well, so that's all we have about pre-Columbian cultures. Obviously, this is a quick summary, not including all the different cultures, not including all the actual knowledge about everything of this, because we're still learning about this. But it's giving us an idea how things were when the conquistadors arrived. So next time we're going to talk about what is called the collision of civilizations. But previously we're going to talk about the pre-Columbian history of gold and silver, which is setting the stage for the Europeans arriving here and taking over